Well, good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim. Today we begin a new year. Well, it actually started on January 1st, but you know what I mean. And we begin a new book. And the book we're going to be reading on Tuesdays with the Pilgrim for the first part of this year is a biography. Well, who is it a biography of, you ask? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's a biography of Isaac O. Stringer. You say, who? Never heard of him. Well, Isaac O. Stringer was a bishop of the Church of England in Canada, now known as the Anglican Church of Canada, who was the bishop of the Northwest Territories. Now, in modern times, the Northwest Territories is a part of northern Canada, but at this time, the time of Isaac O. Stringer being bishop, the Northwest Territories included what is now Saskatchewan, Alberta, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. So it was a very large and vast and wild area. And this is a fantastic and rather enjoyable biography, and the title of it is, which will maybe help you get a little more enthused, The Bishop Who Ate His Boots. You heard that right. The Bishop Who Ate His Boots. So, without further ado, let's get into our biography of Mr. Stringer. Chapter 1. Vocation to the North. From a farm home in Ontario to Archbishop of Rupert's Land, from the simplicity of an Eskimo igloo to the banquet table of King George V, is the intriguing summary of Isaac Stringer's life. Many years later, while recalling a dinner party where they had been guests with the King and Queen, Mrs. Stringer was to say, "What a contrast this is with the sod hut where we lived when we were first married. Then our makeshift curtains were made from my wedding gown, the oven from old tin cans, my rolling pin from a whiskey bottle, and we wore caribou hide clothing." Much of the temperament which gave Isaac Stringer a missionary zeal, combined with a spirit of adventure, probably came from his Irish grandfather, William Stringer, of Derrenclare, Kings County, Ireland. Although details are vague, it is likely that one of the frequent land squabbles there decided William Stringer to bring his family, including Isaac's father, John Stringer, to Canada. In those days, this was a move requiring a much greater sense of daring and adventure than is needed by today's jet traveler. Where the Stringer family first settled when they arrived in Canada in 1846 is uncertain, but eventually they came to southwestern Ontario. Throughout his life, William Stringer showed flashes of attitudes and philosophies which were to be mirrored in his grandson under more dangerous and trying circumstances. William Stringer was always known to his neighbors as Gentleman Stringer, and he clung to a top hat and walking stick, especially on Sunday. John Stringer, the eldest son of William and Mary Stringer, had been baptized on December 7, 1828, in Sharon Parish Church, 2 miles from Derrenclare, as his father had been before him. As a young man in Canada, he settled on a homestead in Kingarth, Bruce County, Ontario, 10 miles from Kincardine. He married Ellen Graham of Bearbrook, near Ottawa, on March 9, 1861. They had 8 children, and Isaac, the fourth, who was later to spend most of his ministry in the far north, was born on his father Bruce's country farm on April 19, 1866. All the Stringer children went to a one-room school which stood nearby on land given by Isaac's father. The school has now disappeared, and little is known of Isaac's early years there. But one of his teachers, Thomas Graham Mathers, who later became Chief Justice of Manitoba, boarded with the Stringers. He was sufficiently impressed with the boy's abilities to encourage his high school attendance in Kincardine. With his backing and help by his preparation by Mathers, Isaac sat for and passed the high school entrance examination, a comparatively rare achievement in those early days. For the next few years, He boarded in Kincardine, going home for occasional weekends. The high school, or grammar school as it was known then, was fairly new, having been opened in 1860, and transferred to a new building 16 years later. The white brick structure stood by itself on top of a steep, stony, wooded bank. The grounds were not laid out for games, but were marked only by a wooden walk from the corner of the property to the door. The classroom walls were painted white, but the floors, worn through the years of countless shuffling feet, remained unpainted. A stove heated the classroom, and a dipper and pail were the 19th century school drinking fountain. Students sat at old-fashioned desks built for two. All pupils paid fees, $8 a year for town students and $10 for those like Isaac, who came from surrounding rural areas. According to an earlier chronicler, almost a contemporary of Isaac's, the students were fortunate in their teachers. Benjamin Freer, the principal, had an Oxford background and taught Latin, French, and English. The assistant master, A.H. Smith, was responsible for mathematics and chemistry. But as far as chemistry was concerned, we were never allowed to perform experiments, the chronicler commented. A hard-working and conscientious student, Isaac completed the University of Toronto admission requirements in 1887. Variety is a term best suited to describe the young man's early religious background. The Stringers had always been members of the Church of Ireland, and in Canada they continued in the same Anglican tradition. His mother had grown up as a Methodist, but was later confirmed and became a communicant. This, along with the flexibility frequently found in rural areas, accounts for the fact that in his teens Isaac went almost indiscriminately to Anglican, Methodist, and Presbyterian services. In a diary which he kept during the summer of 1884, he spoke of belonging to the, quote, Lord's Army, unquote, while at the same time preparing for confirmation. He was confirmed by M.S. Baldwin, Bishop of Huron, on October 21, 1884. In the following year, he was sufficiently impressed by an evangelistic mission held under Methodist auspices to accept a convert's card. As the years in high school drew to a close, Isaac thought increasingly of the future. He could continue in the family tradition and become a farmer. On the other hand, Joseph Morehouse, the young rector of Kingarth, had been inviting him to consider the possibility of ordination. His father, anxious to do the best for him, offered to establish Isaac on a farm of his own or to send him to the University of Toronto. After a great deal of thought, Isaac elected the latter, and in 1888 entered the university and Wycliffe College. Wycliffe College had been founded in 1877 as the Protestant Episcopal Divinity School, and as a direct protest against the growing influence of the Oxford movement. The school began in the parish rooms of St. James Cathedral, with the Reverend J.P. Sheridan as principal, with 9 students. It was dedicated to the evangelical cause, and was inspired by a consuming missionary zeal to bring all men to the knowledge and salvation of Christ, but particularly those in far corners of the earth. Within a few years, the reputation and influence of the college had grown to such a degree that a new building in Queen's Park, close to the university, was opened in 1882. An extension was added 3 years later, about the same time as the institution's name was changed to Wycliffe College. It was to this college that Isaac Stringer came as a freshman in October of 1888, for the combined course in arts and theology. It was not long before he felt at home and was making friends among the other students. There has been an interesting discussion about Isaac's name. He was baptized as Isaac, but by early manhood he was using the signature Isaac O. Stringer, which he retained to the end of his life. The circumstances which led him to assume the second initial have been variously described. There is a popular but almost certainly apocryphal story which suggests that a friend of high school days, having borrowed a trifling sum, gave the lender a paper on which was written I. O. Stringer, the sum of A variation of the tale makes the borrower a prospector in gold mining days. A letter from Isaac Stringer's widow many years later gave the following explanation, quote, "I once heard him explain that there were so many J. Stringers, and that I and J were so often written alike, he thought he ought to have something to distinguish him from the others. About this time at varsity they had a song, I-O, 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 and the students began calling Isaac I-O. So when choosing another initial, he thought he might as well take the one the students gave him as any other. Then and there he began signing himself I-O Stringer." Unquote. Attached to this letter there is a scrap of paper in the handwriting of Bishop Bumpus, with the note, P.S. I think you should choose which you prefer, whether to drop your second initial or to assume the name, say, of Origin. If you are asked at your consecration for your second name, and have to confess that you are only a round O, I fear that it might be deemed absurd and possibly even irregular. Although this was probably sound advice, I.O. did not act upon it. Academically, Stringer was not among the giants, and was always content to devote himself to more practical activities. A great deal of his time was spent in the work of the University YMCA, of which he became president. He was also secretary of the University College Library and Athletic Society, and president of Wycliffe College's Missionary Society. He was active in athletics and was not above the occasional student rag. He graduated from the university with the degree of Bachelor of Arts on June 9, 1891, and received the diploma of Wycliffe College in the following year. Like most theological students, Stringer was occupied during the summer vacations in caring for missions which would otherwise have remained unshepherded. In the summer of 1889, he went to Elmvale, in 1890 to Erin, and in 1891 to Bayfield, all in Ontario. In these years there was nothing startling or unusual in his ministry. He conducted services and preached sermons which sometimes left him dissatisfied. He visited the parishioners, read with them, prayed with them, worked on the church buildings when necessary, and generally joined in the life of the parish. In his diaries at this period he records one incident against himself. "Conversation heard down in the store. Mr. C. to Mr. R. You really ought to try to get out to church. This is a clever young man we have now. Mr. R. Is this the young man I met just now? Mr. C. Yes. Mr. R. He does not look much like a clergyman. Moral: beware of pride, be humble, beware of flattery. Mr. R. Right, I suppose. Isaac Stringer in early manhood gives the impression of being a large and jovial individual, kind and anxious to help, although not beyond a practical joke with his fellows. Above all, he was a convinced Christian, earnest in the practice of his faith, yet almost unconsciously seeking a deeper spiritual life. His diaries at this point testify to regular practice of prayer and Bible reading, but leave the impression of obligation rather than joy and devotion. His appreciation of the sacraments seemed to have been secondary to the ministry of the Word, and he was apparently completely ignorant of the spiritual classics. It was during his last year at Wycliffe College that Stringer's thoughts began to turn to the possibility of missionary work in its more popular sense. The inspiration came no doubt from the interest in missions which had permeated the college from its inception, and which was strengthened by the missionaries who visited the college from time to time with reports of their work in remote areas. In March 1891, the young theological student was introduced to Egerton Ryerson Young, a veteran Methodist missionary to the Cree and Saulteaux Indians, whose book, By Canoe and Dog Train, published in the previous year, had created wide interest. Later in the same year, he came to know the Venerable William Day Reed, and this meeting was to lead him to his life's work in the far north. Archdeacon Reeve addressed a Wycliffe College Missionary Society meeting and spoke of the needs and possibilities of his work in the Mackenzie River Valley. There were many questions in the discussion which followed, and the subject remained on Stringer's mind. A week or so later, he was discussing Eskimo missions with the principal, Dr. Sheridan, but no more came of it at that time. Early in 1892, Dr. Reeve, who in the interval had been consecrated Bishop of Mackenzie River, addressed the students once more. He appealed for 2 men to serve in the north. One would be sent to establish an Indian boarding school at Fort Laird, and the other to work among the Eskimos at Mackenzie Delta, westward along the Arctic coast to Herschel Island, and eastward to Bailey Island. As chairman of the meeting, Stringer thanked the bishop and expressed the hope someone would be found to undertake these tasks. He was quite sincere in his belief that volunteers were needed and ought to be forthcoming, but shuddered at the prospect of undertaking such a mission himself. "It would be a terrible thing, almost suicide, for a man to go there as a missionary," he wrote in his diary. Tom Marsh, a close friend, had already decided to volunteer, and Stringer began trying to find another recruit among the students. None seemed anxious to seize the opportunity, and possibly a few may have suggested that he might go himself. During the next few days he had several long talks with the bishop, joined by Marsh, who was now looking forward to work in the Arctic. Isaac also conferred with the principal. As a result, and after much prayer, he steeled himself to offer his services to the Bishop of Mackenzie River, provided that his family would give their consent. Once the decision had been made, he felt relieved and was filled with enthusiasm for the future. Full of his new plans, he wrote to his father, but was quite unprepared for the blunt refusal which came from home a few days later. On receiving his father's letter, he talked to Marsh, his fellow volunteer. Then he sought counsel and advice from Dr. Sheridan. He tells of wandering from room to room in restless dismay until 1 o'clock in the morning. Distress and anxiety filled his waking hours until the next weekend, when he was home in Kingsgarth, hoping to gain his family's support and agreement in person where he had failed by letter. He remained at home for almost a week and talked of little else but the Mackenzie River missions and the need of the Eskimos. His people were sympathetic, but unbending in their opposition. The day passed, and the time came when he had to return to Toronto. As they drove him to the railway station, his father reopened the subject. He could not, he said, consent to his son's going north. Perhaps in a few days he would see it differently. Then, almost breaking down, he added, "But if you think it is your duty to go, don't let me stand in the way, but write to the bishop at once." Greatly relieved, yet not without many misgivings, Isaac went back to college. He discussed his predicament with his teachers and fellow students. He found comfort and support in the changed view of one of his tutors, the Reverend G. M. Wrong, who had at first been opposed to the idea, but now he told Isaac he was more favorably disposed to his going. The next thing was a visit to the doctor, who gave him a clean bill of health. One by one the obstacles seemed to be disappearing, and on February 17th he wrote again to Bishop Reeve, finally committing himself to work in the north. And that's the end of Chapter 1. We'll continue next week with Chapter 2, and we'll see you next week. God bless.